Good evening and welcome to the 2025 United Service Institute ACT Division's annual dinner. It's a brilliant turnout tonight and we've got a massive engaging discussion happening later, which I'm really looking forward to. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and connections to land, water and community. We would also like to pay our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have contributed to the defence of Australia in peace and in war. Now let's get started. I'd like to welcome to the stage USIACT's President, Bill Henman.
Distinguished guests, members of the USIACT, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Council of the USIACT, welcome to the 2025 annual dinner. A great pleasure to welcome the Ambassador of Ukraine in Australia, His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Hopefully that passes, and his wife, Liana. Welcome. Welcome and thank you, Ambassador, for agreeing to speak this evening. Finally, welcome Major General Retired Mick Ryan AM. Mick has agreed to anchor our Fireside chat format tonight, and Kendi will introduce the Ambassador and Mick in more detail closer to that event.
Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends. History has a way of reminding us that its great turning points rarely announce themselves with great fanfare. They arrive suddenly, often violently, and demand of us not only courage but clarity of thought. Tonight, we gather to reflect on such a turning point: Ukraine, the war that changed everything. The philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." It's a sobering reminder that conflict is not a distant aberration. It is woven into the very fabric and human story. And while we may wish to look away, war in its many forms has a way of looking directly back at us. The war in Ukraine has rewritten strategic assumptions that we held as bedrock. It has shattered the illusion that major war in Europe was consigned to history. We're now watching, though in real time, a modern retelling of David and Goliath. A smaller nation armed with courage, creativity, standing against a larger adversary with overwhelming mass and disregard for the rules-based global order. This is not an ancient story made anew. It is a vivid demonstration of how power, resilience, and the will to fight can matter more than the size of the force that you bring to the battlefield. It's the story of agility, innovation, forced adaptation against a very real existential threat. But this war is not about borders and sovereignty alone. It is about much, much more than that. It is about the contest of ideas, courage in spite of overwhelming odds. It is about democracy its very self. The English writer G.K. Chesterton once said, "The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him." Tonight, as we listen to the Ambassador and Major General Ryan, we must remember that Ukrainians are not fighting for their land. They are fighting for the very notion of free will, for the right of the people, of all people, in the future to choose. And that fight matters deeply to us in Australia, for democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be defended, and when tested, shown to be resilient enough to endure. So what does this mean for our island nation? I think first, that Australia cannot assume geography alone insulates us. The Indo-Pacific is alive with competition, pressure and fragility. Our security rests not just on ships, aircraft and our systems, but our strength in alliances, in our industry, in our democratic values. Second, Ukraine reminds us that technology and innovation can offset raw mass, but only if coupled with people prepared to adapt, improvise and act decisively. This must serve as a warning and an inspiration for our own Defence Force as it looks to modernise for the more uncertain age of the future. And finally, it tells us the contest of narratives is just as important as the contest of arms. Democracies must prove not only that they can defend themselves, but that they are worth defending. Tonight, we are privileged to hear from two voices who illuminates this truth with uncommon clarity. His Excellency, the Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia, who carries the voice of a nation that refuses to yield, and Major General Mick Ryan, retired strategist and soldier, who has a deep given deep thought to what war means to future conflict and the future of democracies like ours in Australia. In conversation, they will help us not only understand that they will not only help us understand that war has changed everything, but reflect on how it must change us. So let us listen closely, not as bystanders, but as citizens of a democracy, much like Ukraine's, which must always be prepared to defend its future. I'm delighted to introduce two people who will lead the vital conversation tonight. First, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Ukraine, who resumed the role as the Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia on the 1st of April 2022. Prior to joining the Foreign Service in March 2022, he served as a member of the Supervisory Board of the Ukrainian Institute, a cultural diplomacy outfit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and was an active business and civil society leader for 2 years. A Chevening scholar, Vasyl earned his Masters of Science in Politics of the World Economic from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2006. He also holds 2 degrees in International Relations from the Institute of International Relations, Kiev National Shevchenko University. Vasyl has 2 children, Yaroslava, Yuri, and is married to Liana. And now, Major General Mick Ryan. Mick spent 35 years in the Australian Army commanding soldiers at the troop, squadron, regiment, task force and brigade levels before retiring in 2022. He deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, Timor. He's also a highly regarded strategist and is the author of 3 books: War Transformed in 2022, White Sun, The Campaign for Taiwan in 2023, and The War in Ukraine 2024. He's currently completing his PhD and working on his 4th and 5th book. I'm honestly not sure how he has a life. Mick is the inaugural Senior Fellow for the Military Studies at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, an Adjunct Fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and is a strategic advisor to US, British and Australian companies in the national security sector. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming His Excellency, Major General, and also Major General Mick Ryan.
Hi, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Candy. We were brainstorming with Mick about how to do this event, because classical fire chat is when somebody is asking questions and somebody is answering them. But both of us have a lot to say, and we like talking actually, so that's good. But you will never guess what we have in common with Mick. We've been born on the same day, actually, and which we learned about 2 years ago. We're both born on June 12th. So every time you call Mick Ryan to congratulate him on his birthday, make sure you give me a call as well. Now, look, the way we decided to kind of play this panel here, and we'll have Q&A where you will be able to ask us questions, we decided to kind of break down the 30 minutes we have into like 3 sections, right? Intro, main section, kind of conclusion on the general theme of lessons learned. And we decided I'll just kick off with an introductory remarks for 3 or 4 minutes, and then Mick will pick it up based on what I said, on whatever he wanted to share, and then we'll just carry on. I think it will be much more, better for everybody, because ideally we definitely could have had somebody here moderating, but I think it's even better. We can just focus on the key stuff, and plus we're so happy to have such a gracious audience and lots of senior, current and former military officers, and I'm sure all of you follow what's happening in Ukraine. And, the difference of this war to any other war before, because you can now watch it live. You just go on YouTube and pretty much you can see whatever happened last night. You get access to all this information, to video materials, and I'm sure for every officer it's fascinating to see what's happening. But let's go to the beginning, because we are here to talk about the lessons learned. And I think the one lesson that I wanted your attention to is actually related to calculation or prediction of potential invasion, right? And this is still, I still don't have an answer to that. Perhaps Mick has his own opinion. I mean, what was out there that the Western world has missed, and what was out there that, what everybody thought was irrational and nobody believed was going to happen was still happening? Why many Western intelligence agencies, I mean, they had the information from the Americans. They knew what was happening. They were pretty direct about what was happening. But at the same time, they kept on believing that it's not going to happen. As you know, the chief of German intelligence agency was in Kiev on the night of the invasion, and he was arguing that Russians will not invade. But they did. And we actually had to spend 3 days making sure getting him out of Ukraine, and then he was fired a bit later. You see, they get it wrong. But you see, the problem is what kind of deterrence we should have built. Was it the fact that Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, later on invaded Ukraine in 2014, and they just got away with that? They got away with that, and everybody went back to, back to business. We were just discussing here at our table, MH17. That was the time when Australians actually went on Google to learn where is Ukraine, right? I mean, this is what happened. 298 people died, including 38 Australians. And all of a sudden, I'm not sure how much you remember, how Russians captured Crimea. It was a little green man, doing a coup d'etat basically. But, it was a special military operation. This is what they did. But it's only on July 17th that when Australians paid attention. And whatever happened after that, it was, Russians figured that was quite good. We grabbed Crimea, we invaded Donbass, and look, everybody wants to do business with us. The captain, Germans are still building those pipelines to buy our gas, our pure gas, so good. And then, they're buying our cars, they buy so much trade and business. Let's just forget about Crimea, let's forget about that slow war in Donbass. Maybe it will just disappear. Maybe it will just evaporate, right? It didn't. Russians used 8 years to beef up their own army, to invest into new capabilities, and come up with a new plan. And I think this is one lesson which I think is very, very important. I think the lesson was we didn't really build the deterrence. Russians thought they could capture Ukraine in 7 days, and that would be it. Fait accompli, everybody would just admit it, and that's it. And I think that is a very, this is a lesson which others are watching. Depending on how it all ends, may actually serve as a roadmap. That's for my intro, yeah.
Hello. Thanks, Vasyl. There's a lot of areas to think about when it comes to the Ukraine war, and for me, one of the most stunning revelations in the last few years is right and wrong still matters. It shouldn't be a new revelation, but I kind of feel in the current age of when everyone gets to pick their own truth, we should be reinforcing that. Right and wrong still exist and they still matter, and what Russia has done is wrong. I think the war is the clearest example of good and evil that we've seen this century in many respects. And to be fair, I think most countries, well, many countries, not most, but many countries have recognised that. And it has woken up Europeans to the fact that they need to take more control over their own security affairs and decision making and resourcing that. That realisation hasn't spread to the Pacific as fast as I'd like, but it is happening here. But I think that's a really important realisation. I think a second one, as Vasyl referred to, is that war's still possible in the modern era. We're not that smart that we can avoid it. Every generation for the last 5,000 years has flirted with this idea that we're smarter than those who've gone before us. We're not going to fall for the same old traps into these big wars. And guess what? Every single one of those generations, including ours, has been wrong. We have to understand that it's still possible and that we need to think cleverly about ways to deter it and prevent some fall into a catastrophic global conflict, which is possible. It's very possible. It's imaginable and possible if we don't prevent it. So I think that's a very important takeaway from the last few years. I think a lot of people like to focus on the new things in this war. My view is there's not a lot of new things in this war. Even the drones aren't new. We've been using drones since the 1940s. In fact, the Pacific Theatre in the early 1940s was the first place in the world where FPV drones were used. the US Navy had drones that were controlled by TV screens in the back of Avenger bombers. So even FPV drones are not fully new. How they've been used is different. The scale that they've been used is different. But most things in this war are old lessons relearned. And that's really important for us because often winning wars is about doing the old things right and doing it better than the other folks. And I think perhaps the most important and enduring lesson that I've seen from this war is that good leadership matters. I mean, there are some in academia who don't believe in the great man or the great human theory. Well, it's a real thing. Individuals matter, not just as presidents, but as section commanders or as community leaders who are helping to evacuate people from burning buildings. Good leadership at every level matters. And this is why I think in the Australian Defence Force and in the three services, we do continue and must continue to emphasise the development of good leaders at different levels, to incentivise good leadership. And I remember as a young Lieutenant Colonel, the Chief of Army at the time decided that we were going to restructure our pay around command. And it was another way to incentivise good leadership. It was to incentivise people wanting to be good leaders. And, you know, we need to be continuing to do these things, but not just in the military. We need to do it in our public institutions, we need to do it in government, and we need to do it in corporate Australia. Good leadership matters, it matters everywhere. And I think if I was to look at one example of amazing leadership in our country, I'm actually not going to look for a military one. I'm going to look to a person in this room by the name of Tom Rogers, who led what I think is one of the great Australian institutions, the Australian Electoral Commission, who I think fundamentally impacted on the preservation of democracy, freedom of speech and free elections in this country, and I think has set us on a pretty good path in the 21st century that is the envy of many in the world. So I think Tom is a great example. I will note he is a former army officer, but I'm sure that had nothing to do with it. But good leadership matters in all walks of life. I think Ukraine has shown us that, and I think too there are people in our own society we can look to for those examples. So I think I'll kind of conclude my remarks there. There's lots of things that we could talk about Vasyl, but you know, when I look at Vasyl, I've known him since shortly after he arrived in Australia, and we've had many conversations and dinners with the families and things since then. I mean, I look at every time I go to Ukraine, it's a different country. It's a different war. The war changes every couple of months. The learning and adaptation that is going on is occurring at a speed that's probably incomprehensible to most people in this country. But that's from an outsider's perspective. I mean, I'd be very interested in your views, Vasyl. How's your society, how's your country changed?
Oh, it's a very good question because we have to go back a bit. Because I think those 8 years that we had between 2014 and 2022 were very, very important. And you have to also look at our society overall. Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine became independent. We kind of got it easy, we didn't have to fight for our independence. Russians have deliberately started different conflicts throughout the Soviet Union. One in Transnistria on the border with Ukraine and Moldova, in Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. There was also some in Uzbekistan. And that was, by the way Russians did it. They did it for the purpose of controlling the former Soviet republics by actually starting wars and conflicts in different parts of the Soviet Union. And we were spared, kind of. In 1993, they attempted to do something weird in Crimea, but then they gave up that idea, so it never happened. In 2001, they actually wanted to grab Crimea, but they also changed their mind. Putin was already a president for 1 year, and then something happened, and it really did not look good. But what was out there in between that period of time for 8 years? Well, firstly, we had war, and maybe it was not that much an international news soon after 2015, it was still very visible in Ukraine. Oh, that's Russians are in the room, huh? I hope not. I'll continue talking because you can still hear me, right?
Can someone get up and do some star jumps and set up the sensor?
So, and in a way, the structure of Ukraine's society, you have to understand that we had a state captured by Ukrainian oligarchs who got power in the 90s because of the privatization, the way the change from, communism to capitalism took place. And then we had that kind of generation of Ukrainian politicians who were milking the state and capturing the government, pretty much is what is called in modern day kind of literature. And there was no trust towards the government. So Ukrainian society, which was shaped by the civil society, was always kind of not trusting the government. And in a way, where it all manifested, and we had several major protests in Ukraine in 1991, 2004, and of course 2013, which was the Maidan Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity. But what is important and why that is important for 2022, Ukrainian civil society, which I was a member of, I was in business and I was a co-founder of several NGOs, it was always our job was to hold government accountable, to help it be more transparent, right? And therefore we never waited for any kind of instructions because we had to self-organize. And that ability to self-organize is instrumental. When we talk about Ukrainian resilience, I often use an example, a metaphor of a beehive. Because in a beehive, we don't really know who runs the beehive. They kind of know what to do, right? And they just do, each bee has its own role within the beehive. And it's a totally decentralized system. And that was part of that society, which turned out to be the resilient part of society. Because when Russians invaded in 2022, every Ukrainian thought, okay, what can I do, right? Certainly there were some who were moving out, especially trying to move their families out of the country. But then they kind of like, how can we help? How can we help the government, right? What can we do? And I will volunteer, I will join the army, I'll pick up the gun, I'll have to get training. How can we help Ukraine withstand cyber attacks? And that cyber attack is actually quite an interesting case because government worked efficiently with the private sector and with people, pretty much, it was business and government working together very fast, including the support we got from Microsoft, from Amazon, from Google and all others to help us save our key digital infrastructure to protect from the attacks, right? And how we managed to save that, and which turned out to be a very important way how you can keep in touch with your citizens who fled and who are now in Europe, 5 million of those. But also then we saw how that digital transformation that was pretty much championed by President Zelensky. And President Zelensky, this is very important, what I didn't finish my start where I started. In 2019 when Zelensky got elected, he wiped out entire political system. And that was a major revolution because all of a sudden Zelensky comes to power and he gets rid of like 3/4 of all the politicians who we never trusted, right? Who we wanted to get rid of, we just couldn't get rid of them because of the way the society was structured where all the oligarchs own all the media, and when you own media you get elected whoever you need, right? And we couldn't overcome that. And Zelensky was one of those who broke the system. And he brought in 300 new people into the parliament who never been in politics, right? Probably in a well-established societies like Australia, I'm not sure it would work if you could, totally change the everybody in the parliament, right? You need some kind
Sounds like a good idea, mate.
Don't get me in trouble. But that was kind of an interesting one. But that I think, partially that was a fact. And then, of course, we had 8 years, right? 8 years of war. It was always in the news. We had training from our partners. Interflex operation was already there. People going through the combat. They brought in some experience. We realized we actually need to invest in our defense industry. And things were happening. So I think those 8 years were very important for us, right? To kind of get prepared. But of course, you can never be prepared for war, right? But I think what Putin has underestimated, he actually, and I think I talked about it the other day. I think that's also, leadership is important, but lack of leadership, that what brings failure. And I think in case of Russia, you have to understand Putin has run Russia in 2022 for 21 years, 22 years pretty much, 22 years, right? And he's a dictator, richest man in the world, he's had everything in his life, what he wanted. What he wants legacy, he wants to be Peter the Great, so he grabbed Crimea, which allegedly was his own decision. He stopped military brass, tried to discourage him from that. And then he does it, and he told them, look, I did it, not a single bloodshed. Everybody just caved in, and Ukrainians were actually, we get calls from Washington, Brussels, don't provoke Russia, don't do anything, just wait. And 2 weeks later, we lost it, right? Because it was unclear, what do we do, right? And that was wrong to tell us not to fight in Crimea. And Putin then said, look, I grabbed Crimea, and Crimea's turned out to be the biggest achievement of the Russian society in 2014, 2015, 2 years in a row in the service. What are you proud of? 90% of Russians said, we are proud that we got Crimea back. And in 2022, all those people who are feeding all that intelligence to Putin, they knew what he wanted, right? They wanted them to kind of give them information, what they've done to undermine Ukraine, what they've done to create a network of pro-Russian groups, how much money they have spent there to bribe, local leaders, how much they have infiltrated Russian Orthodox Church to undermine Ukraine from within, and how many cells they've built in every bloody Ukrainian city, which would be activated the minute Russians step in, right? And they all reported, we spent such and such amount of $1 billion, and it's all good. We just step in, and and everybody comes and supports us. But apparently they all lied to him because they knew this is what he wanted to hear. And I think this is where an interesting lesson, it's kind of a wrong way lesson, but still, that was like, if you have an authoritarian boss who does like bad news, you bring him only good news. And I think those people were only bringing this good news to Putin. You do it and we're in. We're going to get it very quick. And Ukraine is not going to fight. They're weak, they're disillusioned. And all those Russian speakers will come and support us. But God, they got it wrong. Russians always get Ukraine wrong. That's the problem. They always get us wrong, which is, it's not a problem, it's a good thing. Because they just don't know us. We may look alike, but actually we don't, to be frank. We look different. If you look at Russian and Ukrainian, for people who study that part of the world, we look different, right? Of course, because we're colonized, many of us speak Russian, but we're colonized for 300 years, right? But then the identity of Ukraine has changed, and this is what he didn't get. So I think this is kind of like a bit carried away, not necessarily on the military side. Mick will talk more on the military side, but I think that was important. And then, of course, we learned a lot from our friends in Europe. Finland, for that matter. I recommend studying Finnish civil defense. I, in 2014, myself as well as a team of other communications professionals, we created a Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which was a major outfit which countered Russian propaganda and disinformation. And this is when, primarily, by the way, it was funded by U.S. government and other European governments, but U.S. government was the key, and we had 50 people employed, and we specifically dealt with hybrid warfare, countering Russian malign foreign influence, and as part of that work, we were educating and telling Western Europeans how Russians are undermining us and why it's a threat to them. And guess what? Eastern Europe and kind of Central Eastern Europe, Baltics, they of course got it. The more west you went, they said, oh, no, you're just too biased, and we are immune, it's not going to affect us. And look what happens now in many European countries, and how Russians are actually manipulating the whole political system by just really empowering far-right groups, and the way they do it, the way they divide societies, the way they use migrants to generally, and the whole story of the Syrian migrants in Europe. It was really part of a special Russian operation to really, support Bashar al-Assad, to create those, floods of migrants in 2015, because Russians knew that would be a weapon that they could use much later politically, and which they have successfully used, by the way.
I'll go back to the theme of change, because every time I go back to Ukraine, it's a different place, and it's a different war. And I think one of the most profound observations we might make is the country and the military institutions that existed in 2022 don't exist anymore. The military and the country you win a war with is not the one you start with. Profound change happens over the course of a conflict. It's happened in society in Ukraine, it's happened in some respects in the government, but it's certainly happened in the military for many different reasons. One of the key ones is a large proportion of the military in 2022 is dead. Okay, they're dead or they're profoundly wounded and unable to return to duty, unfortunately. So the large-scale mobilisation brought in a whole lot of new, young and not so young people into the military, which has changed how it sees itself, how it makes decisions. And if you talk to senior leaders and junior leaders, as I have, some who fought the Russians since 2014, they've been part of brigades that have been destroyed 4 or 5 times over. You think about that, you go, that changes an organisation, it changes a nation. But they also recognise that these new people who've come in have been essential to their success because they've brought new ideas, they've brought new ways of thinking and making decisions. And I look at that and go, well, how do we get some of that? How do we prepare for that before we have to do that? Because we might have to do that ourselves at some point, and we need to be prepared for it. So change is a constant thing. And every time I go back, I ask, what are your systems for learning and adaptation in this organisation, in this unit? Whether I'm talking to the head of air defence, to General Budanov, to a brigade commander, head of a drone battalion. And every time I go back, the answers get better and better and more systemic and more connected. And they've got to the point where the interaction between Russia and Ukraine, learning and adaptation battle, is moving so fast that, drone technology and software is changing almost daily. Russians on the front line are changing their tactics monthly, if not faster. I mean, we couldn't write a minute to identify the need to rewrite a tactics manual in a month, let alone change them fundamentally in a month. You are seeing the Russians roll out subsequent generations of long-range strike weapons every couple of months. It is moving at a speed that is beyond the comprehension of most people. But the biggest issue we now have is not that this battle, this learning and adaptation battle between Russia and Ukraine is moving at a rapid speed. It is that it is now metastasised into a global adaptation war where Russia, North Korea, Iran and China have formed a learning and adaptation block where they are all learning in real time from each other. That was never the case. I was in Baghdad in 2005 when EFPs came in, and it quadrupled casualties per IED incident. The following year, as General Lay and Air Chief Marshal Sir Angus know, I took the first Australian task force into Afghanistan. I fully expected to see those. And Mark Asco was the 2. Never saw them. That is not the case now. We would see them because these 4 authoritarians are sharing knowledge, not just in battlefield tactics, although they're doing that. They're sharing knowledge in how to streamline rapid production at scale of new technologies. They're sharing ideas in strategic coercion, in hiding weapons programs, in avoiding sanctions. So we're now in a global fight, in a learning and adaptation fight with these countries. Now, we have all the right systems, we have all the right knowledge sets, we have all the right leaders to do this. We just need to connect them up better to ensure that, we preserve democracy into the 22nd century, because we shouldn't just assume it's the case. Because Xi, Putin, Fatboy Kim and whoever's leading Iran this week all think our system should not survive this century. So we need to do everything we can, including improving our ability to learn and to adapt better than what we're doing at the moment. So I think for me that's one of the big observations I take from this war that we can take away.
Absolutely, Mick, spot on. And now, speaking about the scale, I mean, I don't have to explain to you the scale of this war because you all are people, professional, and you follow the war. But what needs not to be missed is that this is the most consequential war in the world. There is whatever happens in Europe now will shape the future of Australia's security. There is just no way how it could be somewhere there in isolation, long way away. And that many politicians keep on repeating that, and I heard that before when I came here in 2022. But actually, it's not that long way away. It's very close. And Russia is projecting power even here in your neighborhood, and they continue doing so all the time. But my bottom line is very simple. Russia has invaded a sovereign country next door, captured 20% of the Ukrainian territory, brought in enormous devastation, huge human suffering. The war is still ongoing, right? And Russians see the weakness. They see the weakness of the supporting countries who are supporting us. And other countries, and of course we don't have to be, we have to name the elephant in the room, China is watching that. And if Russians can end up with controlling that part of the territory, which may actually happen, we'll give them a clear example, because there will be a precedent of Russians doing what they want, because they have nuclear weapons and they're strong, and apparently they had the courage to do what they wanted. Why not other country cannot do it? Why not other permanent member of the UN Security Council who can do the same thing, right? And more so, what can you do about it? How can you demonstrate that the cost of doing it will be high? The only way to demonstrate it is to make sure that Russia fails. And Australia has a vested interest in making sure that Russia fails. You have skin in the game. Because at the end of the day, if Russia does not fail, or Russia manages to capture more territory, and this war is going to go and last for another 5 years, it's no good for Australia at all. It's no good for anybody. I mean, without even mentioning us. Because for us, it's a matter of survival. We are that first line of defense, as much for Europeans as much for you. The fact that you're so far away does not mean it's not what is at the stake, because it's a global fight against democracy. And, here in the neighborhood, last time I checked, there are not many democracies around. I mean, sorry, it's New Zealand there. But that's a different world here, right? And democracy is out there, and we fight for it. We pay a high price for it. So I'll go and talk a little bit about the military side as well, but I think this is very important. How can we demonstrate to China that Russia's behavior in Europe is not a good idea? Only by making sure that Russia fails. And that includes providing more military support for Ukraine. It's actually using the immobilized Russian assets to buy weapons for Ukraine to rebuild Ukraine. It's starve Russian economy by stopping buying their oil. It's sanctions, isolation, and humiliation, right? That's the only way how we can kind of make sure it doesn't happen, right, in the region. Now, on the military side, we still appreciate and very thankful for Australia's support. As you know, Bushmasters have become a symbol of that support, including as the latest delivery of the 37 tanks. But what is now, what we have, which we can offer to Australia, is those millions and millions of hours, terabytes of battlefield information, which is invaluable to your defense industry, which is invaluable to the defense. Because now you have an opportunity to actually see how that war is changing and what is useful for you, right? You need to use proper prompts to go through that material and learn it for yourself, right? Because these lessons learned, both on technology side, operational, tactical level, you know that drones, 80% of casualties are now inflicted by the drones, right? And last year when Russians launched 30 drones and 10 missiles, we called it a massive attack. Now they launch 800 drones and 25 missiles at a time, right? And I was in Kyiv twice now, once in July, now more recently in early September, and I experienced two of those attacks. Look, it's quite confronting. I mean, when you're in the city and Russian drones are coming with the missiles, and it's very loud, and you feel like it's going to hit your house any time. And I don't want you to ever hear that sound, because this is something you never want to hear. And now, maritime drones. It's Magura as well as a number of others. We, of course, had to innovate because it's war and we have to survive. Initially, some of the technology we got from you and other partners we used it, deployed it, made it better, and created new technology. And the innovation cycle is so quick. And today, I think the biggest challenge as we see it, in the world of artificial intelligence, defense industry, and actually the arms race, it at neck-breaking speed. We are now entering the new era where we are actually not capable of catching up with new weapons and the way to protect ourselves from those weapons, because it's all, fast forward. And definitely, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are jumping on that, using it as an advantage, because whatever we come up with, Russians come up with a countermeasure 6 weeks later. So, the drones, which can totally be in a denied environment, have this fiber optic fine line, right, which is like a fishing line, which can go up to 20 kilometers. So you don't really need any communications anymore. And these drones kill lots of other people. It kills a lot of Russian people at the same time. Underwater drone goes into the Russian seaport and it shoots down a Russian fighter jet. It's like science fiction. That's a capability we already built. And I think this is an opportunity for us to develop manufacturing for Ukrainian companies in Australia. And you can invest in that to cater to your needs with some of the new unmanned systems which are being now developed, tested, and improved on a daily basis. Electronic warfare, same thing. I mean, now we need every kind of unit needs to have like 4 or 5 different ways to protect yourself, right? Thales is a great sponsor. We talked now to Thales saying, look, Thales V-shape protects you from landmines, but how can you protect the Bushmaster from drones? You can't. You need to figure out the new shape. You put in that cage that Mick has written about, right? But it doesn't really, how long you can last on a battlefield? Not that long, actually. Any piece of equipment gets destroyed 90 seconds, pretty much. A tank or a Bushmaster, whatever. Because once you're there, it doesn't survive long, but it's just a new war. And I think this lessons learned, but also the technology, defense technology, learning from Ukraine. And I think this is what we are offering to Australia. Come and learn from us. Come and improve your, learn how to shoot down drones, for God's sake. I mean, it's easy. Send the people, go and train them, because you saw Polish could not shoot down 20 drones. They only shot down like 5. The rest just dropped because they ran out of fuel. And they didn't have any explosives, of course, right? But the thing is, you don't use, fighter jets, a missile which costs $1 million to shoot down $20,000 drone. The thing is that now, it's a skill. I think it's a skill which you need to learn. And I think it's a good opportunity, yeah.
I know you want to go into Q&A, so I think I'll just wrap up very quickly. I think, we need to ensure that we're able to pull from Ukraine the right lessons that we need to learn. You can't just take everything that Ukraine's done and just flop it down over Australia or flop it down over Taiwan or Japan. You need to kind of have the right filters to draw the lessons out of Ukraine. But I think there are a couple of really important ones. The first one, I think, is societal resilience. That is foundational to anything we do, whether it's fighting bushfires, fighting pandemics, or fighting off aggression from a foreign military. And we really need to work on the cohesion of our society. I think we're challenged in a way now for societal cohesion that many of us are probably surprised and deeply upset by, but probably surprised by. We have to work on that, but we showed in COVID we could do that, notwithstanding some poor state governments, but I think most of the Australian people really stood up during COVID, and I was very proud of that. I think defence industry, as Vasyl has mentioned, very important. Ukraine had no defence industry before this war. They got rid of it at the end of the Cold War. And they rebuilt a 21st century defence industry. That's the real lesson from the war. Not the defence industry, but a new era defence industry, which isn't just about manufacturing, it's about the interaction between defence industry through key interlocutors in real time. Not over years, but over hours, days and weeks. So I think there are a couple of really important things we can take away. But, we should also be inspired by what the Ukrainian people, not just the military, but the people have achieved over the last 4 years. They're tired. Every time you go there, you see it. They're fatigued by 4 years of drone attacks, having relatives killed and maimed. But they are standing up And I've just put in a plug. If you want to help donate, the Australian Federation Ukrainian Organisations has a bunch of tax-deductible funds that you can donate to. Doesn't matter how much, but every little bit helps. But if you're also talking to politicians, have a word in the area and say Australia's donated nothing new to Ukraine this year, and anything they can do would help. So I think I'll close on that, and that'll be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's been a valuable and brilliant romp across strategic, operational and tactical international landscape. So I'm sure there's some questions out there. I'll ringmaster the questions. You can remain comfortable in your seats. If you could wait for the microphone, stand up and identify yourself and pass the question. Thank you.
Thank you to you both. Wonderful presentation tonight, and I absolutely agree with 90% what you're saying. So I'll just
That's
focus.
better than my average, so
I'm going to give you 90%, sir. So what I will do is focus in on one aspect, and you mentioned leadership. Leadership, you know, at the unit level, guy in the trench to political. But I would challenge that, and I would say, what's going to win this war is statesmanship. And Zelensky is a statesman, but, you know, from Australia, this is first and foremost a European problem. We're at the statesman. Who's going to stand up and champion Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you that we need statesmen, but, you know, it's built on leadership foundations. And, you know, if you had a look at President Zelensky 6 months before the war, he wasn't actually doing that well. He was running 25% popularity, which is even less than, you know, some leaders around the world at the moment. So he wasn't doing that great. But, you know, as soon as the war started, you know, there's that famous video, you know, we're all here. He refused to be evacuated, and that one decision wasn't statesmanship, it was just foundational leadership of saying, I'm in this with the rest of you, I'm staying here, and I think that changed the course of the war. I think truly that one decision of Zelensky's to say, I'm staying here with the rest of you, your fate will be my fate, was the most basic example of leadership, and I think that changed the entire course of the war. Putin didn't expect that. Putin assumed that as soon as Russian troops started running down the road towards Kiev, all the politicians would run to the hills. That was one of his fundamental assumptions, and he got it wrong. So I don't disagree that statesmanship isn't needed, but it's built on basic leadership at every single level of a society, and statesmanship is enabled by leaders from throughout your society, I think.
Let's get to the next question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I've got like a trillion questions, but I'm only going to ask one. I'll put my hat on as I'm a global ambassador with the Halo Trust, so we're now Ukraine's now one of the most mined, it's the most mined country in the world. But my question is really about the David and Goliath struggle that you face. From a distance, we can learn a lot with the vision to look where you are. I think the points are absolutely well made. Vision, the guy next to me has to translate that into action. And they say vision without action is a daydream, action without vision is a nightmare. In that David and Goliath struggle, in the sling, what are the stones in the sling that have made the biggest difference? Is it technology? Is it national resilience? Is it logistics? Or is it something else?
I think it's people. I think it's people saying, nah, not happening. I think it's that basic. I think it's the Ukrainians. You know, on the night the Russians went through those border control points, they went, no, this ain't right. We're not going to put up with this. And, you know, notwithstanding everything that's gone on since, that resolve is still there. You know, it's a tremendous resolve. It's a weary resolve, and it's resolve based on, as awful as this is, we know Russian occupation will be much worse. But that is the most fundamental element of any war, and it's a fundamental foundation of all Ukrainian capability. It's people, and the creativity of people, and the drive of people, and unfortunately the sacrifice of people. And, you know, I've had the opportunity to go pay my respects at several war cemeteries. These are massive and getting bigger, but wars are won by people, not machines, not algorithms, not robots, not anything else, but human will, human innovation, and the drive to succeed.
And I think you have to look into Ukraine's history, and I think this is very important, because if you even look at the 20th century history of Ukraine, you will not imagine how much suffering we had to go through. And I believe that has somehow prepared us from generation to generation, though we passed trauma from generation to generation, but it probably hardened us in a way and prepared us for this bigger war. Because when Ukraine became independent in 1917 and was independent for 4 years, Bolsheviks, communists came and crashed our independence, created Soviet Union. Then they decided to starve Ukrainians to death in 1932-33, killing around 5 million Ukrainians because we refused to join collective farms. We wanted to have our own land, piece of land where we could harvest, which was, traditional way for Ukrainians. In 1937, Russians organized a massive execution of all the public intellectuals in Ukraine. The war came. Soviets started the war with the Nazis in 1939, invaded Poland from both sides, invaded Baltic, started the war in Finland. Ukraine lost. There are no clear estimates of how much Ukraine lost. We know Soviet casualties, 26 million, Second World War. Ukraine lost 12 million on average. That's what we think. Belarus, number 2, around 7 million. And then Russians. So in the Soviet casualties, most of those casualties were Ukrainian. 12 million, can you imagine? Because all the war was either in Belarus, Ukraine, on the Eastern Front, right? This is where all the suffering happened. And then, fast forward, 91, Soviet Union collapses. And my grandfather, who was drafted in 1943 and served for 2 years in the Soviet military fighting Nazi, liberating Budapest, right? He passed away at the age of 95, 1 month before the major invasion in 2022. So I grew up hearing those stories about that period of time, which as a kid I thought it was glorious time, right, of a war. Hey, granddad, tell me more about war, And I never thought that that would be something that I would have to go through, or my kids would have to go through. So this war, 11 years, so we now have kids who went to school in 2014, and they graduated from school now, and all they know is war, right? 25% of Ukrainian territory is mined. We'll need 2 generations or 3 generations to clear it up. We ask Australia for support. You have state-of-the-art equipment produced in Adelaide. MineLab is producing equipment which is being used by Halo Trust and all different UN agencies. You can procure it for us and send it to Ukraine. It will save many lives. It will save many farmers who are, they keep on harvesting because we feed 400 million people in the world. 400 million people depend on food from Ukraine. If you care about Middle East depends on Ukraine. They will starve without Ukrainian grain. Africa will starve without Ukrainian grain. Because 97% of what we produce, we sell. We only need 3% of what we produce. So, and we need to clear up the fields. We need to clear up the fields to be able to continue doing that. To send sunflower oil, to send wheat, barley, corn, vegetable oils. This is what we produce. We have one of the most fertile lands in the world, heavily not polluted by unexploited ordnance and the mines. Thank you.
Good evening, Yvonne Butler from the National Security College. I'd like to engage you a little more in the topic of national resilience, social cohesion and social licence. Unfortunately, Ambassador, there is nothing like a war to get everybody on the same page from a citizen's perspective. We don't want that in Australia. What can we be doing now to make us as a country more resilient, to have our citizens more engaged and supportive of what we're doing from a defence perspective, given the focus that we need to have on domestic defence operations?
The good news is we're not starting from zero here. I mean, there's lots of community groups, there's politics, there's a whole range of mechanisms for people to have conversations. They just need to have more honest conversations from the top down. I think the last few years we've seen various Australian governments not really wanting to be honest with the Australian people about the full breadth and depth of some of the threats that we do face. So honesty in those conversations is important. But I think all the foundational organisations and community groups are there to have them. But resilience is more than just human resilience. Part of that is things like education about cyber threats or social media, or just making sure kids get a good education, they can read and write at school. But it's more than that. I think cyber resilience is very important. Sovereign data is very important. Making sure our electricity, our water, and those kind of systems are resilient, that they can't be interfered with, because theoretically they could be. So, I think resilience is a pretty big ask. It's pretty expensive, and I don't know that every government is keen to do that until there's a brownout, and then all of a sudden it becomes a pretty big issue. But it has to be a national, a state, and a local conversation. It can't just be one level of government that's focusing on this. It's not a federal thing. It's a federal, state, local, community thing, and it does need to be led from the top. And I think that's something we probably need just a little bit more of in this country, is leaders who will actually go out on a limb, not worry about the polls, and just talk about what the right things to talk about are, not the things that poll well, because all that does is breed more complacency, and there's more than enough of that to go around. One of the great things I loved about leaving the military is I can talk about politicians now.
Desmond Woods,
USI. Your Excellency, we've been hearing for about 3 years about the possibility that the confiscated funds held in the West from Putin's banks are going to be made available for the purchase of weaponry for Ukraine. But this seems to be a receding horizon. We never actually get to the point where the funds are handed over. What is your understanding of what the problem is?
Well, actually, there is some progress there. The issue is not yet solved. So that around 300 billion Russian dollars. Dollars of the Russian state, which are primarily in Europe. There is an interest from that. And last year, EU came up with an idea how to package a loan for Ukraine, which will be paid off by the interest generated from that amount of money, around $3 billion per year in interest, which would just pay off those 50 billion euro, which EU has extended to Ukraine last year. So we've started using, at least interest rate from that money. Now, actually, there are some interesting developments, and I think pretty much a lot of that is driven by certain European leaders, and this is by our leadership matters, who believe that we should find a mechanism of how to use the money entirely. Initially, the question was, well, if we just take it away, what we're going to undermine trust in euro, we're going to undermine trust in our system to keep, this reserve money in our jurisdictions. So this is kind of a legal debate, right? But this legal debate comes down to one issue. The issue is, can we ever impose reparations on Russia? Can we ever impose reparations on the country which has 5,000 nuclear warheads? Is it possible at all? The only way how we can make Russia pay is to use that money. That's it. And that would be a very strong signal to any other authoritarian leader who may want to attempt to do the same thing. Look what happened to the sovereign, money of Russia. Look what happened to the sanctions. Look what happened to their economy. Look what happened to them. I think that would be that mechanism on how you can actually do it and deliver that, we will never achieve justice. That's the problem with this war. Ukraine will never achieve justice. That's very sad and unfortunate. But that's the only way how we can achieve at least justice partially. Because how can we hold Russia accountable for the act of aggression, which is the most, egregious egregious violation of international law, if there is one. There is no international law. Let's face it, we're all grown-ups here in the room. There is none. It doesn't exist. I mean, it's a fiction. Because there's no sanction for violating international law. Condemnation, There must be a price for violating that. And it's none, It's only naming and shaming. But Putin doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about their reputation. Russia doesn't care about it. I mean, that's unfortunate. That's the way where we live in. And of course, in what kind of message is sent? You have to be strong militarily. You have to invest money in your defense. And that's an arms race which has started. But definitely, those assets, I hope they will find a solution. And I think the fact that, American leadership is currently, of course, Europeans have to step up, right? So they have to come up with money. And here's the money. Just take it and use it for Ukraine. Buy weapons in Russia, in the US, buy weapons in Australia. Now, why not buy weapons in Australia? We could do it. We could use that money to buy weapons from you guys. Or whatever we need. And I think that would be quite fair.
Nick, anything further? Final word?
I would prefer Vasyl.
Unfamiliar as you are with
I would prefer Vasyl to have the final word because I think Vasyl over the last 3.5 years has done the most magnificent job in representing his country, his government, and getting around this country as well as New Zealand almost every day, seeing very little of his wife and daughter Yuri. He sees his daughter Yaz every now and then when she gets to visit, but he's given everything, I think, to represent Ukraine, to explain to normal Australians, to link up Ukrainian community groups, to represent his country to the government of Australia. And my final word would just be to thank Vasyl for that, thank him for his friendship, thank him for his sacrifice, and to ask you to thank not just Vasyl, but Liana and his family for everything they've done for Ukraine. Thank you.
That was my job, Mick, and that's a demarcation issue we'll talk about later. I'll wrap things up here. We have a few things to conduct after I do wrap up. I'm not going to try and summarise what we've just witnessed here. There's something for everyone in this presentation and this evening, from the strategic, political levels through the operational and down to the tactical. We all peer at the television screen or our phones through YouTube. We can get a very intimate engagement with this conflict at those levels: strategic, operational, tactical. You can fill up, your whole day with other commentary. I think what is important and what we have the privilege of witnessing tonight is an interpretation of all that through two different perspectives. In a setting like this, hopefully it hasn't finished and we've got plenty of time left to engage. But having these perspectives presented tonight with Q&A, I think, is of value, and the USIACT feels very privileged that you're giving your time and those perspectives tonight. So thank you again very much.